Well, last week you had a very long set of notes. Hopefully, this one will be a little bit shorter. We're talking about the Great Depression. Um, it's pretty straightforward. But what we want to think about when we look at the Great Depression is the way that the role of government changed during this period. Remember, during the 1920s, laissez faire, hands off government. And that's going to be the plan going into the Great Depression. Remember, during the 1920s, there was a lot of signs of economic weakness. We talked about overproduction with the assembly line. And because so many people were speculating in the stock market, right down here, they weren't reinvesting in their companies. And because they weren't reinvesting in the companies, well, that meant that they were not coming up with new products. They weren't hiring workers. And when they weren't hiring the workers, that meant that they couldn't sell as much product, which leads to that idea of overproduction over here. By the end of the 1920s, people were running out of credit as well, and they didn't really have the new stuff to buy because there was no reinvestment in the companies. So consumer spending went down. So consumption was decreasing as they ran out of credit, overproduction, stock market speculation, and then all of this idea of buying on a margin is really going to come back to bite people. Remember, buying on margin is when they borrowed money in order to buy stocks with the assumption that the value of the stock always goes up. And then once it stopped going up, everything just crashes. One important thing that we didn't mention previously was that there's a growing gap between the rich and the poor. There's always been rich and there's always been poor. But in the 1920s, what was happening is that the rich were getting richer and the poor were actually getting more poor. So that income inequality, we'd actually probably call it wealth inequality. There's two differences there. Income is how much you're making per year, but we're talking about wealth inequality as well. The rich have more money kind of stockpiled. That's their wealth. And the poor people just had nothing. They're living from hand to mouth, from paycheck to paycheck. And that means that they aren't able to participate in that consumer culture. So while the rich are getting rich on the stock market, poor people aren't able to invest, throw money into the economy and participate. Which means the value of the stocks is actually artificial. It's not worth as much. The companies aren't worth as much as the stock would suggest. Remember, during the 1920s as well, farmers are struggling. There's less farmers, one, because there's more people living in urban areas than rural areas. Technology allowed more people to leave the farms and move to the cities. And even though there's less farmers, there's more production. So if we look here at these tables, which are kind of interesting, you can see the number of farms from 1910 to 1960 almost halves, and also the number of people in agriculture halves, but they're actually making more products. So that overproduction is going to lead to another drop in prices. Part of that has to do with World War I, because World War I had caused those farmers to buy more machines, caused them to buy more land, created more stuff. And then all of a sudden, Europe is now producing their own products again. That means that there's a drop in demand while there's an oversupply, which leads to really drastically low prices. Now, in 1929, the Great Depression does begin. I want you to remember that the Great Depression is not caused by the stock market crash. The stock market crash is a symptom. Just like if I have a cold and I sneeze, the sneeze doesn't cause me to have a cold. The sneeze is a symptom that I have a cold. All of that economic weakness that we just talked about, that's what leads to the Great Depression. But it's the stock market crash that signals, that's the sneeze, that we are in a depression. Stock market crashes on a Tuesday, it briefly rebounds, people come back on Monday, and it crashes again. Now, what was the government's role, or what do they believe their role was when the economy collapsed? Well, initially, the government felt that it needed to protect American businesses by putting up a massive tariff, like nearly 50% tariff on incoming foreign products. The idea being that you tax those foreign products very high, people would not buy any foreign products, and people will buy American goods that would help protect American businesses, which protects American workers. And that worked back in the Hamilton era. It doesn't work here in the 1920s and 30s because we're now a global economy. Remember all that stuff we talked about in American imperialism. They wanted more markets to sell stuff. So they wanted that global economy. But when you put up a tariff, those foreign countries don't have enough money to buy American goods. It stalls the European economies, who are also struggling. Remember, the Great Depression is a worldwide depression. It's not just in the United States. It has to do with all the stuff leading out of World War I. So all the economies are struggling. The massive tariff means that those other European economies couldn't pay their war debts, which leads to bad American economy. It also means that the European countries and other countries are going to raise tariffs on American stuff, so American businesses can't sell there. The tariff turned out to be a really bad move. The Federal Reserve, which controlled money supply, the rate of inflation, did something that backfired as well. During the 1920s, they had a loose money supply, which means it was very easy to get loans. There wasn't a lot of regulations on it. And what a lot of the wealthy people that could get those loans did was borrowed money to invest in the stock market by buying on margin. So what the Federal Reserve did was tightened up the money supply. They made it harder to get loans, made it harder to get cash. And that means that those small businesses that were struggling couldn't get loans to stay in business. When those businesses collapsed, that meant that the workers that had been part of those businesses, well, they lost their job, which means they couldn't buy stuff, which means other countries struggled, or other companies struggled, which then means they went out of business, and then those workers lost their jobs. And by 1933, 3 years after the Great Depression is shown to begin with that stock market collapse, unemployment in the factory system was 25%. 1 out of 4 workers had lost their jobs. Those that kept their jobs were working reduced hours or reduced wages. And that only includes factory workers. That doesn't include farm workers. And if you put up that number, we're looking at more like 33 to 40% unemployment. Banks were weakened by bad investments, and that led to bank runs. Now, at this point, banks were they were a business, and banks still are businesses, but they're protected. There was no protections in the 1920s. So when a bank made bad investments and lost that money, that means everybody that had put their money in a savings account or had a checking account or whatever the case may be, lost their money as well. Because that would leave somebody to panic if they thought the bank might struggle, if they thought that their bank might fail, if there was a whisper, a hint, an allegation that the bank was failing, they would run to the bank, which is why these are called bank runs, and take their money out. But when that happened, everybody did at the same time, and they took so much money out that there was no more money left for the people at the back of the line. They called that going bankrupt. There's not enough money left in the bank to give everybody their loans. So folks that deposited, when the bank lost their money, they just lost their money. There was no protection. So bank runs were a fixture of the Great Depression. You can see in this chart here are the bank runs. There we go. Here are the bank runs. In 1828, there's not very many, but by 1929, you can see the bank runs skyrocket here. The Depression does have an impact on industry. The Depression led to a decline in production. You can see here, this is 1929, right? Just before the stock market crashed, this is the number of automobiles that are in production. When the stock market crashed, there's a rapid decline in the amount of automobiles produced. And then as the Depression goes on and the economy gets a little bit better, more production ensues. It's a vicious cycle when the stock market crashed. And then you throw on it this geographical disaster, this ecological disaster. When the Great Depression hits, the Dust Bowl also hits. They're kind of interconnected here. The farmers were already struggling, but the Dust Bowl makes it even worse. You can see in this picture right below me that the brown areas are the lightest hit. The red areas are the ones that were hit the hardest. So this area right here was the area that was the most severely harmed by the Great Depression. Millions of people had to leave their homes because of these dust storms that just covered up their fields and killed every plant that was being farmed there. When they had to leave, what most of these folks did was moved west because there's land out there available, or at least they believe there's opportunities out there. As they moved west, though, these people were poor. They tended to be from farms. They're moving to areas that are already occupied, and there becomes a derogatory slur used against them called Okies. You didn't have to be just from Oklahoma to be an Okie. It was just, were you coming from the Midwest Dust Bowl region? Were you poor? You were an Okie. And then they ended up doing a lot of migrant labor work in California. They were picking fruits and vegetables for other people And they were seen as kind of the lowest rung of society at that point. The book The Grapes of Wrath does a good job of talking about this. I'm not going to read this for you. You can pause it and read if you'd like. But what Steinbeck writes about here is the Dust Bowl, the environmental crisis, but also the thing that a lot of these people faced, and that was moving into the West and being on that lowest rung of society. There's a very severe human toll to the Great Depression. This is a bread line over here. Oh, you can see it over there. That's a bread line. Those are all men, mostly white men, standing in line for free coffee and donuts. There was no, excuse me, there wasn't really any unemployment insurance from the federal government. Whatever unemployment was through the states, and the states didn't have a whole lot of money for unemployment insurance. So a lot of what helped the people through this was charity. There was a lot of hunger, a lot of homelessness, birth and marriage rates both plummeted. Divorce rates went down as well, but that's just because a lot of men just abandoned their families. They didn't bother hiring a lawyer to get divorced. Remember this with the birth rate. Birth and marriage rates are important here. They're an economic indicator. They're not really an indicator of something else. So when the birth rate goes down, it's usually because the economic situation is poor. When the economy is going really good, people have babies. And when they don't think they can feed their baby, they don't want to have kids. There were a lot of desperate responses to the Great Depression. For example, working women. Women tended to be the first ones fired from their job. At first, women were the first to get fired from the job because they were seen as taking a man's job. As time went on, women tended to have lower pay, so they were often facing lower unemployment. Although you got to be careful because unemployment is a tricky number to understand. Unemployment is only, you only count towards the pool of unemployment if you were out there looking for a job. So a lot of women didn't go looking for a job. So while they had low unemployment, a lot of that just means a lot of them weren't looking. Minorities face the most severe response. So in the Black community, 50% unemployment, and they face severe discrimination. They were the first fired and the last rehired in this Great Depression. Hoover's response was, pull yourself up. He called for volunteerism. Rather than order businesses to maintain hours and wages, rather than pass some bill that would just give people money, Hoover asked people to do it on their own. He asked businesses to stay open, to maintain wages, to maintain hours, and they just couldn't. They didn't have the money to do that. The money supply was too tight because of the Federal Reserve. They couldn't get loans to stay afloat. So volunteerism didn't work. Hoover refused to use the power of the federal government. He is in that laissez-faire mentality that the businesses will fix themselves. He expected private charities, things like churches, individuals, to make ends meet. If somebody didn't have food, he was hoping that communities would help provide that food. He tried to send an upbeat message that based on past economic performances, recovery was right around the corner. But they didn't count on the fact that they had artificially inflated the economy through all of that laissez-faire, buying on margin credit. The peak got so high that this valley was incredibly deep. And Hoover's going to be blamed for a lot of the problems, even though it probably wasn't really his fault. Presidents don't really do much for the economy. He does try to balance the budget, arguing that if they could get their budget balanced, if there's less debt, then that would be good for the economy. This proved to be a bit short-sighted. He increased taxes at a time where people just didn't have taxes. He cut budgets when people really needed help. They didn't buy into this idea of Keynesian economics yet. Keynes said that governments can borrow money pretty cheaply, so that during a time of economic need, big government should borrow a lot of money to restart the economy and then pay off that money later. They didn't buy into that yet. So Hoover tried to balance the budget, promoted this idea of rugged individualism, people doing it on their own, and eventually things would get better somehow, some way. The thing that hurts Hoover because people didn't like Hoover. He's not helping people. He's very cold and stays out of people's lives. something that during the 1920s, when the economy was good, people really liked. But he makes a number of tactical errors. For example, he gives monies to businesses, which made, when people are starving, they made it seem like he cared more about business than people. But his biggest criticism was of the bonus army marchers. So there's a group of World War I veterans that were promised a bonus during the 1920s for later in the 1940s when they were about to retire. It's kind of a thank you gift for serving in World War I. And Congress had promised to give them this bonus, but then the economy crashed. They weren't due to get their bonus yet, but a lot of the veterans lost their jobs. They wanted to get this bonus early to help keep their families fed and keep their homes and all that. Congress refused to give them the bonus early. So a lot of the veterans gathered into what were called the Bonus Army March. They just kind of went across the country. They marched to Washington, D.C. They set up a Hooverville outside of D.C., shanty town built with just kind of scraps. And they went to Congress and protested to try to get their bonus early. They were even willing to take a decline in it, but Congress said no. So here they are outside of Congress protesting that they wanted their bonus. They set up that little shanty town. And then Hoover, who wants to run for re-election in 1932, can't run on the high quality of the economy like he did in 1928. So he decides that he wants to be the person that's maintaining law and order during this bad economic time, which kind of makes sense because in a lot of other countries, they were having a lot of bad things happen. This is the rise of Nazism in Germany. There's protests and violence in other countries. He wanted to be the president that maintained order during the Great Depression. And he looks around Washington, D.C. and sees this shantytown of veterans, and he thinks it's going to make him look bad. So he wants to get rid of this bonus army town, little Hooverville outside of Washington, D.C., and try to make himself look good. He sends in the authorities. Didn't go well. The bonus army marchers protested. Then he sends in the military, thinking that they'll follow orders because they're all veterans. They refuse to leave again. The commander in charge sends in smoke grenades, which catches the shantytown on fire. And now Hoover looks like he is physically attacking veterans who are just asking for some bonus money that they were already promised in order to survive. And he comes off looking cold and heartless, and now he's attacking American veterans. There's really no way that he has any chance winning in the 1932 election. The opponent that he's running against is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Hoover is unpopular. He's seen as helping businesses over the common man. He's seen as attacking soldiers that just wanted help. People wanted government action, not his optimistic words. Delano Roosevelt, Franklin here, which is like a sixth or seventh cousin of Theodore, but Franklin Roosevelt was running on this idea that he was going to promise to use the government to help people. He's not worried about laissez-faire. Laissez-faire didn't work. So he wants to use the government to provide some basic necessities. He called it the 3 R's. No, he's not a pirate. Relief, recovery, and reform. Relief is immediate help. Recovery is getting the economy back on track again. And reform is trying to change the economy so it doesn't break again. The United States has gone through a severe depression like every 7 or 8 years going back to the founding generation, mostly because of this laissez-faire policy. Much like the Civil War, the Great Depression here now proves that in this time of crisis, the presidential powers, the executive branch, is going to expand its power. FDR easily wins. FDR is the red here. Hoover only wins in these areas where there's a lot of industry and banking because they didn't want the government to step in and do that. FDR promises to help the people. The federal government is going to go on to take a more active role in solving economic problems and directly trying to help people's lives.